Hi there, I am the Mighty Sea Bear, and today I want to talk about Anthem and its endgame, and why I am concerned about the endgame specifically and what that could mean for the health and livelihood of the game going forward past the launch. So, before I get into that though, the gameplay that you see in front of you right now, it's just the second half of the Tyrant Mine Stronghold that we got to play during the Anthem demo. It's the hard mode version. It's the only run of hard mode I did. But there's nothing special about it. It's just there to be interesting eye candy while you listen to me just ramble. But anyway, to get started with the subject material, the endgame of Anthem, I want to talk about what we know, what has been confirmed, and what has come directly from BioWare themselves as far as the way the endgame is supposed to act. So the first thing I want to talk about is that there are only going to be 3 strongholds at the launch of the full game. And that bothers me for a few reasons, because the way the stronghold works right now, it's the most structured, high-level mission that we have access to as players at the beginning of the game. And a lot of people have been comparing them to a midpoint between a strike and a raid from the Destiny series, and I think that fits very well. The stronghold has 3 encounters in it, and they each one kind of has its own specific objective that you have to complete, which is kind of cool. It's not just straight kill a bunch of dudes, which is fine, but 3 still feels low to me. For a game like Anthem, I would have felt like the full game should have launched with maybe 7, maybe 8 of them. There's definitely plenty of lore and things in the world to cover 7 or 8 of them, I think. They don't even necessarily have to be faction based, because we know one of them, Tyrant Mine, that we got to play is going to be spiders and or scorpions. Sorry, that's what they call them. Scorpions and Scar. Temple of Scar is pretty much exclusively Scar, and we don't know what the third one is, but I think it's a fair guess that it's going to be Dominion based. But we could get one that's maybe just kind of world-based, where you just have to fight through a bunch of stuff that just spawns in the open world, like Anrosaurs or Wyverns, or maybe there's like a Wyvern Queen. Would that not be freaking cool? But no, we only get the 3 at launch. Now, they have confirmed that there will be more added to the game after the fact, and that's going to be a theme going forward that you'll notice. But anyway, 3 strongholds at launch just makes me uncomfortable, because I don't know how fun it's going to be rerunning the same 3 strongholds over and over and over again to just get the same loot drops over and over and over again. Next, the next bit of endgame content that we know of for sure is legendary contracts. So for those that don't know, there are regular contracts, which are just regular contracts, and then there are legendary contracts. Now, all contracts function somewhat the same, in that they take place in the open world rather than in their own specific instance like a stronghold would. So you select the contract you want to do, you launch into it, you end up in the open world, and you have a series of objectives that you must complete in order to fulfill the contract. You go and you do it, and then you head back to Fort Tarsus. Just like a regular mission, it just takes place in the open world, which is kind of an interesting concept, and it gets more interesting. Regular contracts are just like that, but legendary contracts are slightly different in that they are supposed to be more challenging and more difficult and reward you better for your time than a regular contract would. Another very important and unique thing about legendary contracts is that they have a degree of procedural generation to them, where the objectives and the enemies that you fight and what you're asked to do during that string of objectives you have to complete is somewhat randomized. Now, how many different variations of each unique contract there are, I don't know. Nobody really knows, because nobody's been able to do more than one at a play session before. But that's an interesting concept. It just feels like busy work, though. It feels like strongholds should be the main event, and then legendary contracts should just be some sort of busy work that you can accomplish. And we'll see if that estimation holds up when the game launches. But that's the other thing that we know of for sure, that we have specifically been outlined for us by BioWare about how the endgame is supposed to work. The next thing that they talked about when talking about endgame was cataclysms. And cataclysm is kind of just an in-universe term in the game for live event. At least that's how it seems. They were described as being large, sweeping changes to the environment and the world around you, and in Fort Tarsis even, that would change the availability of missions and contracts and affect the way that you played through the game, essentially. And that might be interesting if strongholds kind of vary up depending on the current cataclysm going on in the world at the moment. That would be kind of interesting. That would make it a little bit easier to replay, I think. But we'll just have to wait and see. We don't really know anything about cataclysms. We know far less about them than we do legendary contracts and strongholds, because we haven't seen an example of one. And the more I think about it, the little world event that we got at the end of the demo with the Storm and the Ash Titans, I actually don't think that was a cataclysm. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the other thing that we know of for sure, is cataclysms are supposed to be a thing. That's the word that they use for it, and that's how they're supposed to function in a very loose sense. And then there is the trials. Trials are a set of daily, weekly, and monthly objectives we don't really know much about these either. We don't know what kind of rewards are tied to them. We don't know what kind of objectives we'll need to complete our trials. But we do know that trials are a thing. There are your daily trials, your monthly trials, and your weekly trials, just like I just said. And presumably there will be some sort of reward tied to them. I would imagine that these trials will also be tied to any relevant cataclysms going on at the time. But that's not confirmed. That's just a speculation on my part. It just would make sense. And that's all we know about trials so far. But they are a thing. They are supposed to be something that you can work towards, and we'll see if the rewards live up to that. They've also talked about how the world is supposed to be dynamic and ever-changing, and things can change on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And this is supposedly is like completely separate from the whole cataclysm thing I talked about a second ago. Apparently. And I think really the Storm and the Ash Titans were an example of this dynamic world that they say that they're going to have in Anthem. And I think that's a cool idea. And I am skeptical about it though, but we'll get to thoughts and feelings later. And the last thing I want to talk about, as far as what we know and what has been said by BioWare or BioWare employees, is it's a kind of a curious thing. They call it aspiration content. And I know this because I read an article, I think it was on Eurogamer, about Anthem's Endgame, and in which the reporter had actually gone and played some Endgame Anthem content with, I think his name is Jason Dara. But anyway, they were talking to Dara about the Endgame, and they started talking about raids. And Dara talked about how, as a studio, they're trying to stay away from the word raid. Because its perception within our community is that it's a very difficult piece of content that requires heavy coordination, more than 4 players, they said like a cycle of 5 bosses. He made it sound very, very specific, the way that a raid was supposed to work. And he said that they didn't want that kind of level of content, not really that level of content, but that kind of exclusivity, I guess, is what he was getting at in Anthem. They wanted Anthem to be more flexible. They wanted whatever you were doing to be, well, it's not like they don't want challenge. They just want for everything to be more available to everyone, is kind of what the idea was behind that, I think. And because of that, while there are no quote-unquote raids scheduled for the game, there are these things that he called aspiration content, which is what a raid is. Which what he said a raid was, is this quote-unquote aspiration content, in which you'd have to coordinate with your buddies. It would be something you'd have to plan out, and there would be ways to display in-game, presumably, whether or not you were good or bad at said aspiration content, and there would be rewards and everything associated with it. It really does sound like something similar to a raid, designed for players, mind you, that was confirmed. But to me, it just sounds like something that's got a little bit more meat to it than a Stronghold. Because Strongholds are great, don't get me wrong. There just won't be enough of them at launch. So whatever this thing is that they have in development, I really hope really does take the cake, because this game needs something. It needs a thing like that. Something challenging and more difficult that you kind of have to play as a team to accomplish. Even the hard mode Stronghold that I played, that you're watching right now, didn't feel that difficult. In fact, I don't think I'd die even once until the very end. But that's a whole other thing. But anyway, that's all that we know so far. That's all that has been said. As for what all of that means, there's kind of two really important factors at play here that they seem to have in mind when they're as they're designing and preparing for the launch, and that is they have a very hard emphasis on live support. They really want to continue to make content for this game. I don't know if I mentioned it already, but this game is confirmed to have waves of free updates that will add things to the game for us to do and to find, I guess. And this also includes story content. One of the things that was also mentioned in that Eurogame article was that Dara had mentioned, I believe, that they had years of narrative story content planned out for the future post-launch, which is really cool, and that's great. So that almost makes me wonder if part of their heavy focus with this game was on the story. And we'll see what happens when the game launches, but I'm perfectly fine with that if that's the case. This is a studio renowned for its storytelling, and if they bleed any of that skill into Anthem, I'm cool with that, as long as it keeps me playing the game. And that kind of coincides with their live support mentality, where they're talking about changing things in the world day to day, week to week, talking about these cataclysms, talking about live events and things like that. They really do seem to have, like I said, again, a really heavy emphasis on things being added to the game going forward. For free, mind you. My only problem with that is that it makes me feel like they might have cut content from the full release of the game to make sure that they had stuff to add later down the line. And that bothers me. I don't think that should ever happen. A good example of a game that has had lots of free content updates, not huge, mind you, but they have been there, and didn't skimp on the full game content either, is Monster Hunter World. Monster Hunter World is one of my favorite games of all time at this point. And it was just an original price of $60. You get in, there was tons of content in the base game, and they just kept adding more. They added, I want to say 8 monsters or something like that after the fact. Several of them, almost all of them actually, endgame monsters to fight. And then they've had tons of live events along with that. One festival for every season. They've had several collaboration events. They have a continuous rotation of event quests that cycle in and out. Monster Hunter does live support pretty well, in my opinion, and they have a big gated, another pay-gated, huge expansion coming out in the fall of this year. Iceborne, and that model I think works really well, and if that's what they're trying to go for with Anthem, please, by all means, do that. But my concern is, again, that the level of content available in the full game on release would have intentionally been cut down or at least skimmed for the sake of adding things later, and I don't like that. And another thing that bothers me is some of this stuff we've heard before. We've heard the whole dynamic world spiel before, where things would change, everything would change from time to time, and different things would happen in the world and whatever. And quite honestly, I'm honestly kind of tired of hearing that at this point, because every time that a studio has promised that, it's essentially been false. The way that we received it and the way that they portrayed it were the same, but what they meant and what we interpreted it as ended up being completely wildly different. And I don't want that to happen again. I do not want this game to have the same problems that the Division or Destiny had, or even Destiny 2 had on launch. Because let's be honest, those are its contemporaries, them and Warframe, I guess. But I really hope that it doesn't fall to the same problems that they did. And all this together makes me very concerned for the initial longevity of the game. And what I mean by that is the game is going to be popular on release. Don't get me wrong. It's going to sell a bunch of copies. It's going to probably, I don't remember what the ranking system, but it'll probably go platinum relatively quickly, if I had to guess, considering how many people played the beta. I'm just worried that there won't be enough at the end of our story loop to really keep players coming back. I'm worried that the endgame won't be deep enough, and I think that they might have been too reliant on adding stuff into the game after the fact to really see that. Unless the speed at which they add content, the first content drop, unless the first content drop is the next month, unless it is in March or early April, I don't know that this is going to be enough. I'm just worried that we're going to have another Titanfall scenario where the game is explosively popular on release, but loses its entire player base within a few months just because there wasn't enough to it. And I desperately hope that's not the case, but that's my biggest fear. Now, before I end the video, I kind of want to talk about a little bit about how this system could actually work. What would keep people coming back to play a game, even with somewhat bare bones content at the end. Now, along with this, I want to talk about unique loot. I want to talk about loot drops that are unique and specific to certain enemies or activities or something along those lines that are strong enough or potent enough or flashy enough to grab the attention of players and make them want to grind for these items. Because in a looter shooter, it really is loot that makes the world go round. Story is fine, story is great, and those of us who are returning BioWare fans and who actually care about the story will be excited for additional story content after the fact. But for most players in the game, it's going to be the things that they can get. It's going to be the ways that they can show dominance over their enemies or each other. That is going to be what really sells things for players, for the majority of players, myself included. And I think one of the best ways to do this is unique loot drops. This could be kind of annoying a little bit, but it would also be rather creative, I think, for a game like this. To take an example from the demo, with the world event that happened at the end with the Ash Titans, what if there was a specific gun or piece of gear that could only drop from Ash Titans? So you'd be relegated to the specific few story missions that have Ash Titans in them. You only get to run through those once each anyway. Or you would have to randomly run into one in the open world, and there's no better time to do that than if they have an increased spawn rate during a storm. That would be kind of cool, I think, and that would allow players to kind of grind for something on a certain day. Like, say, the Fist of the Crucible unique flamethrower that at the Masterwork level for the Colossus only drop from those. That would be a really cool thing to go and try to grind for. Say it only dropped from Ancient Ash Titans. That would be really cool. And I think that kind of system, if extrapolated across the rest of the game, including things that they add like new strongholds and cataclysms and other dynamic world events, that would be really cool. I think that would be one really strong way to increase the longevity of the game, not just at launch, but just in general. But the thing is, if there's no content hard enough that you need that kind of thing to make it through it, that you need some sort of crazy awesome loot drop to make it through it easily, that I think is where you run into a problem. Because if you're not struggling at all in Grandmaster 3 with your all rare gear, I don't think that special loot drops are really gonna do it. Are really gonna make it to where players want to grind for them, because that people want to be able to accomplish things that they couldn't before. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but anyway, unique loot drops for specific enemies or activities, I think, are one really solid way to accomplish this what I'm talking about here. And that's really the only way that I think that this could work. Other than potential cosmetic upgrades that are only available from certain events or cataclysms, or a unique currency or something that you can only get. If they do some way, if they make some sort of in-game way to earn shards through live events, content updates, then that's a whole other thing entirely. That I could make a video on that alone, but that would be one way to incentivize it. But aside from that, the only way that I can really think of is unique loot drops, and then on top of that, some sort of additional high extreme difficulty activity that you can take those unique loot drops into and be successful. But they haven't said anything about that. I'd be very skeptical to say, like, I really don't believe that any system like that's in the game, even though I think it's the best way for it to work out. But all that being said, that is what I think. That is why I'm worried in 20 minutes or less about Anthem's Endgame. I'm just going to leave the rest of the gameplay rolling. There should only be 5 or 6 minutes left in it if you want to see me get to the end. But anyway, let me know what you think if you happen to scroll by this video, or it pops up in your recommended feed by some chance. But without any further ado, I'm going to head off of here, and I will see you in the next one.
Even the way it dies is unnerving.
I wonder how many bruises it'll take me to forget that thing. I'm gonna go with 8.
One for each of the tyrant's legs.
No more scorpion talk, please.